Okay, 12:01. Good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are coming in from. And welcome to this edition of PON Live. My name is Nicole Bryant, and I am the Managing Director here at the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. The Program on Negotiation is a consortium between Harvard University, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Tufts University. And we are so delighted today to be featuring an event with Carri Hulet, PON affiliated faculty member on collaboration in a time of climate change. But before I turn it over to Carri, let me just welcome all of our participants who we see are coming in from all over the world. Love to see where you're joining us from. We know that this is a busy time for you, and we really appreciate you taking a moment out of your lunch break, out of your day, out of your evening to be with us. It is a special thing to be able to convene and talk about these important matters. Carri Hulet, who is with us today, is an adjunct faculty member here at the Program on Negotiation. She co-teaches PON's Negotiation and Dispute Resolution Seminar. Perhaps we have some of her students, in fact, on our Zoom today. She is also a principal at her own practice, a strategic advisor, a process designer, a facilitator, and a consultant. She's going to talk to us about a lot of the great work that she's doing and some of the most important issues that are facing us today around collaboration and climate change. We're delighted to have her with us today. She's going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we will, of course, open up the Zoom to questions. So if you do have a question, what I'd ask is that you put it in the Q&A function at the bottom of the webinar. That allows other participants to upvote your question and indicate that they are interested in it as well. Of course, you can use the chat at any time if you have a comment. Those are the ground rules, and now I will pass off the Zoom microphone to Carri.
Great. Thanks so much, Nicole. Well, I'm really happy to be here. And in fact, I am looking at the participant list and seeing some of the students, excuse me, from the class that I teach, which I'm really happy about. And also loving this chat where folks are saying where they are calling in from. That is really thrilling to me to have such an international audience. This is really very exciting. And I just want to tell you all that when I wrote the description for this session, I thought I might simply describe some of my work and then connect those stories to how I think about designing effective collaboration. At least that's what I assume you're all getting from the description that you would have read. But as I really sat down to prepare and put together this talk, I came to appreciate the extent to which I have experienced quite a profound shift in my practice over the last few years. And I am really excited to share that with you. And so I thank PON genuinely for giving me the opportunity to reflect on my practice and share these thoughts with all of you. And I really want to thank Nicole, of course, and James Kerwin and Diane Long in particular for the opportunity to do this and for their guidance and assistance. So this shift I talked about, let me attempt to illustrate this with a GIF. And if you have not had the distinct displeasure of seeing this GIF before, then my apologies for being the one to introduce you to it. It's been called the most irritating GIF on the internet. And if you're a person who prefers GIF to GIF, you're now double irritated, I am sure. But the beauty and the trauma of this animation is that just as you feel like you're getting close enough to understand what you're looking at, you feel like you're back where you started. And working on climate change can feel like this sometimes, like every time you make progress, the problem gets more complex or the scope of the impacts broadens or simply things don't go the way you expected. And then it feels like the rug gets pulled out from under you and you're back at square one. Well, I've been working on climate change for almost 10 years, long enough to have experienced this feeling of vertigo several times. But over the last few years, I've started to feel more hopeful, like we can actually get out of this cycle and stop and learn from our mistakes and make some meaningful progress. And the thing that has changed my perspective, my change in my worldview, has come from really learning about and trying to appreciate the principles of equity and justice in my work. And as I am growing in my understanding and appreciation for principles like shifting power and allyship and process flexibility, my work is changing profoundly, and I am glad to share a few concrete examples today. And I hope sharing this will be helpful to anyone trying to use collaborative approaches to address climate change. So I'm a facilitator, so I can't proceed without going over the agenda. Just want to give you a sense of where my talk is headed. So as Nicole said, I hope to talk about 30 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. And I'm going to take a moment just off the top to kind of give a sort of orient folks to climate work in a simple way that I hope will ground the rest of the talk. And then I'll share a simple framework that I use as I'm designing the collaborative processes that I'm involved with. And then I will share 3 case examples from my current work and explain what I'm learning from those engagements. So first, let me just give you a real quick and dirty overview of work on climate. Those of you who work on climate and are here on the call will certainly feel dissatisfied, but I hope it will be enough for us to be somewhat on the same page as we talk through the work I want to share with you. So practitioners who are trying to help reduce the harmful impacts of climate change basically work in 3 buckets. We try either to stop making things worse, or reverse the harm that we've already done, or seek to protect or reduce the harm that is happening or on its way. So in the first bucket, trying to help stop make things worse, this means reducing greenhouse gas emissions, essentially. It includes policies and practices, sticks and carrots that encourage behavioral changes like transitioning to clean energies, making heating and cooling more efficient, eating less meat, those kinds of things. The second bucket that some practitioners are working on is trying to figure out how we might reverse the harm that we've already done. And this includes solutions like geoengineering and carbon capture. And then the third category is about protecting people and plants and animals from the impacts of climate change that we are already experiencing and that are baked into our biosphere, even if we stopped emitting greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, which we won't. And so protecting habitats and people from the increasing risks as we attempt to ramp up our success in the first 2 buckets. So in other words, this category is about protecting what and who is at risk of being hurt or displaced by a changing climate. And you can think of measures like building flood barriers or creating programs to ensure that elderly folks have indoor cooling, or company or union policies that keep outdoor workers from getting heat stroke. These are just a few of hundreds of examples. And so the first 2 buckets are broadly called climate mitigation. And the last bucket is sort of commonly referred to as climate adaptation or climate resilience. And I work almost exclusively on projects in the 3rd bucket, though I have done a little work on mitigation. So I just wanted to orient you that way as we talk about the projects that I do. So let me just give you a few examples. This slide will be in the slides, and so I'm not going to talk through all of these. These are just a few examples of the kinds of projects that I work on. But let me just highlight the 3 that I am going to talk about in greater detail in this talk. The first is I'm going to share with you some work I've done in Boston on sort of assessing the risk from an extreme storm in Boston Harbor. So that's with a group that I work with called the Resilient Mystic Collaborative, and I'll tell you more about all 3 of these in a bit. The second is a network building project where we're working through the Climigration Network to connect practitioners and frontline communities that are facing displacement due to climate change. And the third is a project that I think of as building power, a power building project in which we're just starting to support a cohort of grassroots organizers and then connect the dots between the work that they do and climate change. So before we get into these projects though, let me share a little bit about how I think about designing collaborative projects. And I think it's fair to say there are 2 kinds of people in this world. There are people who like process and like to geek out about it. And because this is hosted by the Program on Negotiation, I'm assuming there are a handful of you out there. But then there are also people who just could not care less about how the sausage is made. They just want it in the end. And so if you're in that second category, you might want to go grab a cup of tea or something and come back in about 8 minutes, because this is about to get unbearable as we really dig deep into these process questions. But for the rest of you, my tribe, the people who love process, we're just going to diverge for a moment from the topic of climate change so I can share my sort of design and thinking mind when it comes to collaboration. So the first question or sets of questions I want to deal with is the engagement type. So what do people want to achieve basically, and how are we going to do it? And I like to think about clarifying the purpose basically of the collaboration and answering the question broadly of what we're expecting from each other. Now, there are, of course, shades of gray here between these 3 buckets, again, that I have kind of laid out here. And long-term engagements almost always have phases of each of these kinds of, or these types of engagement. But just to make it easy, let's say that there are 3 kinds of engagement: dialogue, consultation, and decision-making. So if it's dialogue, there is really no intention of coming to agreement. Rather, the goal is to increase understanding, for example, to share knowledge or information, to increase understanding, or maybe even to heal or to build relationships. But once there is an agreement or a decision on the table, then we're into this other one of these other 2. And consultation is when you sort of need the collective wisdom of a group, and you may need to assess the degree of agreement within that group. But consultation means that this group, while it's in the service of decision-making, the decisions are not being made by this group. They're being consulted by the decision makers in some way. And so there's really no promise being made to this group that the decision is in their hands, though they may very significantly influence it. And one thing I want to note about consultation is that you are trying to assess the degree of agreement, but the disagreements can stand. And in fact, sometimes one of the huge benefits of consultation is that you try to identify where the agreement and disagreement might be, and then to account and document for that disagreement. And then finally, there are just a host of kinds of collaborative engagements that require group decision-making. And if that's the case, one of the first things that I realize we have to figure out with the group is, what does that agreement look like? If they have to make a decision together, is it just majority vote? Or are you seeking something closer to consensus? And what does consensus mean for you? So I call this we in the field call this the decision rule. So at what point do you know a decision has been made? Is it unanimity, where everyone has to affirmatively agree? Is a supermajority okay? So you could actually take a vote, and if it's something like 80 or 85%, then you move forward. Or frankly, my favorite decision rule, and the one that most of the groups that I work with uses, is no one opposes. So it doesn't require the affirmative support of all of the members in the group, but it does require, in order to move forward with a decision, that no one opposes it. And that allows for, decisions to be made, and some people still to save face in that process without having to, again, explicitly support it. So these are just examples of the way you might decide how that decision would get made. But the bottom line is that you have to agree. The only unanimous agreement that has to be made is, what will our decision rule be? So moving from engagement type to the second sort of area that I think about when I'm designing these processes, which is, who has the authority to make these decisions, and who is responsible for the implementation. So some of you may be familiar with President Truman's desk plaque that said "the buck stops here." I think quite a bit has been written and spoken about this. But for me, when I'm asking questions about authority and responsibility, I'm essentially asking, where does the buck stop with this group? And it's not always clear. So one of my jobs is to raise the question of, where does the buck stop, or who has the authority and who has the responsibility, and sometimes engage in a collaborative conversation about that question even before the collaboration gets off the ground. And as the number of parties increase, the challenge can also increase, until in some cases you end up feeling like you're pulling your hair out, or your non-existent hair if you're Spider-Man and your head is, what is that, neoprene or something? Anyway, the bottom line is that it's important to get really clear on where the buck stops before engaging in a collaborative process, and then clarifying throughout that process, as roles and players change, are we all still on the same page about where sort of any authority and responsibility might lie? The third area, or sort of space that I think about, is representation. And there is a link between representation and authority, but I want to make a distinction. Authority or responsibility tends to, though not always, tends to relate to formal positions or even legal requirements. So who is required by the process to be ultimately responsible? Representation is much more about who is affected by these decisions. And this becomes really important when you are doing work in communities, of course, because the decisions that might be made by any group, at least the groups that I work with, because I work in the public space, always affect people who are not necessarily at the table. And so you have to work hard to think through, how do those perspectives get represented at the table? And there are questions even beyond sort of who is affected and impacted and how does their voice get brought into the process. There's also a question about whose perspective or voice makes the process legitimate. If someone feels that they've been left out or their perspective has been dismissed, then you can go through a really good, quote unquote, process, really well designed, transparent. You can work hard to find agreement, all of those things, but it will then be deemed, or it could be deemed, not legitimate because there were voices that were not included. So really thinking ahead, if we get to the end of this process and the outcome is seen as having views absent, for example, who will deem that to be not legitimate? And then finally, I just find it's really important, the more I do this work, to think about whose ideas will make the project sing, or will make it really great, right? You can do a collaborative process and get the job done, but you can also miss opportunities to make it really wonderful. And very often, I think the people with some of those really best ideas are the people who have been dismissed by other processes, who, or maybe who are in the opposition, right? And are seeking to upset the apple cart because they're seeing, for whatever reason, that this process is going to land in a place that feels like, like where they've landed before. So I really try to think about who has the good ideas, and maybe others are not seeing, and we can bring in. So then this last category I call the grease and the bumpers, by which I simply mean how you scope the project. What are the limitations? So who can make this project work? What are their capacities? What are their skill sets? What is my skill set, and where am I lacking? Who else do I need to bring in order to make sure that this works? So this really comes down to, again, sort of scoping the work. How long will it take? How much do we have? How much money do we have? Those kinds of things. And of course, you really can't design a collaborative process without knowing those limitations, those bumpers, or without knowing the capabilities and capacities of the people and the sort of systems that you're working within, the grease. So that was our diversion into collaborative design thinking. And now I'm going to go back to the case examples. And what I really want to share with you here is sort of give you a perspective of what this looks like in practice, or for real life, as my 4-year-old would say. So let me talk about these 3 projects that I briefly mentioned previously. The first is a project with the Resilient Mystic Collaborative, or the RMC. I will probably refer to it going forward as the RMC. So the RMC is a watershed-scale climate collaborative in the communities that are in the Mystic River watershed, which is just sort of north in Boston. You can see, if you're familiar with the area, you can kind of see Boston down there at the bottom of this map, including East Boston, and all the communities that feed into the Mystic River. And there are 21 municipalities. And we started this project in 2018 when I was a senior mediator at the Consensus Building Institute in collaboration with the Mystic River Watershed Association. And I really want to acknowledge my partner there, Julie Wormser, whose idea this collaborative really was. And so the idea behind the collaborative is that in this area in Boston, where I live in Medford, which is one of those communities right in the middle of this map. We can't really become safer from the impacts of climate change unless we work across town and city boundaries. And so the collaborative is designed to get all of these municipalities and also private organizations and NGOs in the area together to think about what can we do together that we couldn't do on our own. And I want to highlight one particular project. So the RMC does a lot of projects. We have a lot of things that we work on, but we started a project a couple of years ago to assess the vulnerability of some critical infrastructure in in the Boston Harbor and the surrounding communities, and then to ask, how does any failure of that infrastructure affect priority populations? So the purpose was to assess this potential damage in a really significant and extreme, but not impossible extreme storm in our area. And the infrastructure that we're looking at is the subway and train lines. We have a number that run through this area, surface roads and tunnels, energy stations and oil terminals, the Logan International Airport. We have a lot of hospitals and clinics in the area, and the water agency. And so this is the kind of infrastructure we're looking at. And we modeled a storm and said, what happens in this extreme storm to this infrastructure? But at the same time and in parallel, we also asked, how do those failures affect people of color, people with low or no English proficiency, essential workers, people who actually work in these places, some of this infrastructure that I've mentioned, on the public transportation and at the oil terminals and at the airport, et cetera. And also people who are elderly, or people who are children, or people who care for the elderly and children. And so we asked these questions in parallel. And this project, I'm not going to take the time today to actually talk about the results of this project. I am happy to share with anyone later that information. But I do want to talk about the shifts that I have experienced as a practitioner working in a collaborative space on this project. So the first is that most vulnerability assessments on climate do look at infrastructure. Now, there are infrastructure assessments and there are social vulnerability assessments, but rarely are the two done together. And often the infrastructure assessments focus, or at least a huge part of the work, is on cost-benefit analysis. And that leads to prioritization for prioritizing protection of the most expensive things, but not necessarily the most important things. And I have, through this project, we sort of had a hypothesis going into it that doing this kind of assessment side by side or in parallel, that we would have different results, and that those results would protect what was most important, not necessarily what was most expensive. And that was the result. So one of my big shifts is that I think climate actions must be informed by a deep understanding on the impacts of the most vulnerable. And that is moral, certainly, that is part of it, and that matters to me. And it is also practical, because as I mentioned earlier, for example, the people who are most impacted by climate change and climate impacts are also the people who are the engines of our economy, and in many cases of our culture. And so any impact to them is an impact to us all. So I think finding ways to make sure that we deeply integrate and understand those impacts is critical. A second shift is that we anticipated, certainly, I've done climate work long enough to know that you can't just waltz into a community if you are not a part of it and start trying to do community engagement. That is a lesson I learned a long time ago. And we tried to be really progressive and thoughtful about the design of this project, and put in place, when we sought funding from the state, the requirement that a huge amount of the budget go toward compensating community-based organizations who we expected and hoped would be our partners in conducting the community engagement. And that was good. I think that was important. And that just that shift would be good to see more often. But while we did that, and I think it was useful, and there were some important, and I'm satisfied with the outcomes, it just wasn't enough. We learned as a team through this process that it's not enough just to compensate. You have to truly partner, and well in advance. We would have designed the project differently if we had done closer and more respectful and more engaged partnership with the community-based organizations ultimately. And going forward, I will certainly do that. And then finally, we had to really be flexible during this process. This engagement took place during COVID, and the community-based organizations we were working with, they had to pivot immediately from the work that they had been doing previous to the pandemic to pandemic relief. They were taking care of people's basic needs. And as you can imagine, administering the community engagement process for our project had to fall down their list. And because this was a state-funded project, and state-funded projects tend to stick to deadlines and be rather stringent, it became our job as the sort of project managers to advocate on behalf of our community-based organization partners for additional time, for flexibility. And that, again, taught me that if we really want to understand how vulnerable populations are affected by climate change, then we really have to dig into, or rather commit ourselves to some process flexibility that align with principles of equity and justice, recognizing and acknowledging the work that they're doing. These are some shifts from that first project. The second bit of work I want to share with you is on the Climigration Network. Several years ago, I was impressed, along with several colleagues that I was working with, at the real challenge, incredible difficulty, and the sort of enormous scale of the challenge of climate-induced relocation. And these are some images that I just wanted to share because I think they give a sense of the difficulty of even talking about climate migration. These images are from an artist named Bruno Catalano, and they represent the loss that one feels when leaving behind a homeland or a place that one would call home. And as we started building a network of people who were also concerned about this significant challenge of places that are becoming increasingly unlivable due to climate change, we were sort of a practitioner base, right? Folks who had more sort of professional perspectives on these questions than firsthand experiences. And for years, we just really wanted to engage with frontline communities. That was our intention, and we wanted as a network, as a growing network, to create a welcoming space. But somehow we were not achieving it. And last year, we hired a new director, Kristen Marcel, and I really want to give credit to her. She really started listening to communities in deep ways. She said, she really said, we have to stop worrying about what we're going to achieve here. Well, I don't know if she would say that. I'm sure she cares about what we are achieving, but she said, we have to stop and listen and build trust with these communities. If they are not feeling welcome with us and not feeling like we are in solidarity with them, there's a reason, and we need to understand that. And just dedicated time and resources to listen to and advocate for changes in the way that the network is structured. And so this has precipitated a great deal of learning for me. And these are kind of in two ways. So one is that climate practitioners, our expertise and education are simply insufficient for working with marginalized communities. We do not know what is needed, and we are not trusted. And the way to become useful and helpful is to first appreciate that and understand it, and to recognize that we need to educate ourselves and we need to question our worldviews. I've been engaged in sort of a handful of different things over the last several years now to increase my education and my understanding of these equity and justice principles that I've talked about. And in particular, the Climigration Network is now requiring members of the network who want to be in partnership with communities to complete an equity and justice curriculum and to self-reflect on their own practice and how these principles change the way that they think. And I think that kind of work is necessary for climate practitioners. And the second point is that communities who are suffering from climate impacts are necessarily organizing in order to try to get the resources and the support that they need, because most of the impacts are due to systemic barriers and systemic issues and historic issues. And so they are, by their nature, in order to be more safe, needing to advocate. And as practitioners, we must find ways to support their advocacy. This is a different space for practitioners like myself who are in what we consider to be neutral or third party roles. But increasingly my experience and my sense is that we have to find ways to support that advocacy if we're really going to help them become safer from climate impacts. The third project I want to share is a community building cohort. And this is just a new project. We're just barely starting to get it off the ground. And so I'm really learning as I go. But I'm supporting an effort that has been convened by the Grassroots Fund and is also has funding from the Barr Foundation to build solidarity and relationships among community organizers who do not have climate as part of their mission. These are folks working on food security, on housing, and they haven't to date said or sort of entered, if you will, the climate space. But the intent of the project is to build their power so that they can take leadership in the climate resilience conversation in Greater Boston. And what that looks like in a very simplified form is that the funding that is available to these grassroots organizations will not be doled out by the foundation. It will be distributed among the participants of the cohort through a giving circle, and they decide amongst themselves how to distribute those funds. So there is complete empowerment in the cohort in terms of the actual funding. A second element of this project is that we are there simply to support the relationship building and the conversations that they want to have. So as a facilitator, my job is generally to sort of propose and lay out agendas and try to think through what a sort of program might look like from A to Z in this case. That is, I am stepping way back from that and saying, I will support the design, the collaborative design that you need and that you want, but you are in the driver's seat and I am here to support. And then finally, these groups are coming on board with an interest in understanding how does climate affect the issues that they are dealing with. And so my big shifts are to really understand that community building is climate resilience. So if what we want is for people to be safer from climate change, then we need to understand why people are not safe in their homes, why there's not sort of the ability to get good food, why workers are, and why and how and in what ways workers are not being supported in the way that they need to or paid what they need to be. So dealing directly with these impacts of climate change is actually climate resilience, even if it is not called that. And that has been a profound and important shift for me to make. And then in practice to try to support that work, even if the sort of connection to climate change is not immediately obvious and needs to be advocated for. And then finally, my last shift to share with you all is that shifting power to people advocating for systemic change is absolutely critical, because so much of what we see in climate change and the impacts are the results of systemic barriers and systemic challenges. And so working on those systems is necessary if we're going to make progress. Well, I'll just end with this quotation. I was at a bat mitzvah over the weekend, my friend's daughter, who also is our babysitter. And I was flipping through the prayer book and read this, and it just moved me deeply. It's a rabbinic saying, and it is not your duty to complete the work, neither are you free to desist from it. This really captured the way I have felt about my work in climate change. It feels so impossible so often, but I feel drawn to it and compelled, and like I have to do my little part. So I'm really grateful to have been with you today and to share these thoughts, and can't wait to hear some of your questions. And I think I just turn it over to you, Nicole, right, to moderate.
Yeah, that's great. I know that there are a lot of questions, so I'll actually tee some up for you, Carri, and we can have a little dialogue about them. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I've been writing down some things and really just, love your energy and your perspective on this. And I think this is a really important discussion for us to be having, as evidenced by all of the questions that we have in the chat. So I appreciate that when you started talking, you immediately went to process, because of course at PON, that's very dear to our hearts. So let's start with folks who have questions about frameworks and how to design. So we have a couple of questions. One, can you recommend specific frameworks and resources for those who are looking for vulnerability assessments for extreme weather impacts? Are there things that you have used, or are they all self-designed? Can you talk a little bit about how you've created or adapted those?
Yeah, let me answer that almost without answering it. This is the type of thing that I think if I were going to recommend specific kinds of things, I would want to actually pull up the references and send it. But let me just, I guess, sort of broadly answer the question. So there are, let me back up a little bit and say, there are many ways to conduct an assessment, whether it's a social vulnerability or an infrastructure vulnerability assessment. And there are all kinds of models out there. And I would say that they're ever improving, right? We have not been doing this for so long that I think there's a sort of golden method out there. The challenge that we faced in this project, and I think that anyone who wants to do this going forward will continue to face, is what is the combination of elements that I have seen in other assessments that make sense for us? And I'm just going to highlight one sort of challenge that we faced, and give all the credit to our partners on this, All ACEs, which is an organization in the greater Boston area, for figuring out how we, not just how would we go into the community and ask the right questions, but what would we ask about, right? So there's so many impacts from an extreme storm. What are you going to ask about? And so they did a really interesting link analysis as one of the first steps in our methodology, where they looked at the literature that looks at infrastructure impacts and tried to tease out from that impact literature who was being affected by those impacts, and then connecting the dots between what was in that work and priority populations. And that was a really necessary first step that we, the project designers, did not anticipate. We sort of assumed and hoped that they would have a methodology, right? Mm-hmm. And they had to sort of design it because there isn't really a solid methodology for that. So I will say to the person asking the question, if you want to reach out to me separately and say, can you give me some references for various assessment methodologies, I'd be happy to send you some references. But I hope for now that is at least a somewhat productive answer for you.
Yeah, okay, great. Wonderful. And we had one specific question about the vulnerability assessment that was used for the Mystic River Collaborative. Where did you get the data to make that, to ascertain that? Is it from members themselves? Did you conduct a study? How did that process go?
Yeah, that was really interesting. So we, on the infrastructure side, we did two kinds of things. So we did draw on existing information. So the Department of Homeland Security has pretty extensive information about impacts to critical infrastructure in the area. So we certainly drew on that. But we designed for our assessment, we designed a self-assessment that was modeled after some work that had been done in New York City for each of the infrastructure managers to do about their own facility. And then we also ran a tabletop exercise with all of the infrastructure managers, in which we gave them the storm, we gave them the sort of impact metrics that would be interesting to them and useful to them in terms of how much flooding there was over what period of time, et cetera, and had them articulate, if this were to happen, what would be the impact at your site? And then to connect and then to share that among the infrastructure managers to understand what the cascading effects would be. So if the airport is flooded at such and such point in the storm, or if this tunnel is flooded at a certain point in the storm, what effect does that have on the hospitals? What effect does that have on if the oil terminals, for example, are flooded and can't get the fuel out, then what effect does that have? And just as an example of the outcome of doing that, we really learned that nearly all of our infrastructure in the area is just incredibly dependent on generators and the fuel that would be filled. And of course, all the critical infrastructure feels that they would be the first to get refueled when they need to, but they can't all be refueled at the same time. So that's a real challenge that we have in this area, is figuring out how to decrease the dependence on fuel in generators in a storm situation like this, as an example.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. It's interesting because in the chat, this is what I love. We have some questions that are very environmental based, some questions that are very process based questions, and so it's great. We're going to cover all of the things. Let's start with folks who are wanting to know a little bit more about how one gets to become a facilitator and get into this kind of space, and once you're even doing that, what steps do you ensure to make sure that you're an effective advocate working alongside the different advocacy groups? How do you achieve legitimacy? How do you first get into the field, and then how do you achieve legitimacy and build up that process when you encounter a new set of stakeholders and a new set of problems and you're jumping in there?
It's hard to answer this question without telling an origin story, and
I love it.
Resist.
Origin story here.
But I think everyone who does this kind of work comes at it from a different place. Actually, it's a really interesting field because people have such diverse entry points. My entry point was that I sort of came into the field, I guess not late into the field, but late in terms of developing a career. I was in my late 20s, early 30s when I found mediation and negotiation and dispute resolution, and I was exposed to it first in a class, basically, where I learned about negotiation, and I was interested in public policy and in political science in general, and so I was introduced to someone who I guess is like who I am now, right? Who told me about her work. And it just sounded fascinating to me. And so I just started trying to connect with people who were doing this work and learning about what they did and how they went about it, and took several jobs early on that were quite sort of adjacent to the work, right? And tried to develop my relationships with people. Ultimately, I took a job in somewhere that was not where I intended to live. I was living in Boston when I was exposed to this work, and then got a job in Utah with the Langdon Group, which is a public involvement firm that is a subsidiary of a civil engineering firm. And they do a lot of transportation work and really high conflict work. So I ended up being able to work there and be in really high conflict situations around some really complex infrastructure projects. And that was really valuable. And that was kind of where I guess, professionalized the work. So ended up ultimately coming back to MIT and then working at the Consensus Building Institute, which is one of the few firms in the country and in the world, really, that focus specifically on training and supporting people to do this work. And so I don't know how much that answers the person's question. I think everyone takes a different path. There are a lot of attorneys in this field who decide that they want to go about their work differently and get different kind of training, often at the program and negotiation, actually. And I think there was an element, Nicole, of your question that I'm not answering, something around
the second piece. So thank you for the origin story and sort of how you came to this, because it's useful, and there are undoubtedly folks who are very well versed in these processes on the Zoom, but there are also people who are looking towards a career and trying to develop that. So I do think that's great. The second question was, someone was asking, when you come into a new project, what are some of the steps you take to ensure your legitimacy and get buy-in from folks early on, and what are some of the, I don't know, tricks of the trade that you might say to get to that process, which you need to achieve at the end ultimately?
Yeah, there's always an assessment phase at the beginning of every project, in which I am assessing who are the key players, what is the nature of the conflict or disagreements, or just the dynamics among the folks that I'll be working with. And in the sort of environment around them. So that assessment can take various forms. It can be reading what is already documented out in the world on the issue at hand. It can be interviews with the potential participants. It can be some sort of survey or other intake instrument just to get people's perspectives. And I think that the thing that establishes legitimacy pretty quickly at the beginning is demonstrating that you can listen, that you can interpret, that you are willing to be wrong, that you are trying to really understand the situation, and that when and where you find yourself to be less capable of understanding exactly what they want you to understand, that you are humble and willing to admit that and say, teach me, like help me understand. So I think being in this role, it's a lot of listening, synthesizing, iteration, saying, is this it? Did I get it? If not, and then I think one thing that I've started to own a lot more the longer I do this is that the better you get at also suggesting ways forward without making it feel like that has to be the way forward, right? Then the more helpful you are to the clients. So for a long time, I really thought the less expertise I have in a space, the more useful I am, because then I won't influence it. I feel the exact opposite. The more expertise you have, as long as you're able to balance your what you think the group should do versus what they think they should do, is completely critical. So I find that I am serving now as much of the mediation facilitation role as the strategic advising role. And I just try to make sure that I'm clear, at least, on when I should be wearing each hat and checking in with the clients and the stakeholders to ask them, I have some ideas about how to move forward here. Are they, is this the time? Are they welcome? And also being really clear, you don't have to take my ideas. This is your process, right? You're ultimately responsible for it. So anyway, I think that's how you establish legitimacy, is be clear that you can listen, be willing to be wrong, and then to make strong suggestions and, in ways that people feel like they can wholeheartedly reject them if they want to go a different way.
Me too. We have a bunch of questions about sort of the power dynamics when you have all of these multi-party actors, frankly, in the process. So one question was about municipalities and governments. How can you overcome resistance or hesitation to shift power from these, large, either, localities, territories, or whatnot, to local advocacy groups? What are some of the strategies that you would take on to empower those working at the local level?
Well, everybody responds to what is best for them, right? So if you think about sort of the very basic principles in negotiation around understanding interests and working from interests, that's the key. So what is in the municipality's interest? What is in their interest is to be successful at supporting the public that they have stewardship and responsibility for. And it is very easy to find examples of ways that any government, whether local or state or federal, has failed the people that it is supposed to be representing, right? And very often those failures are the result of not sufficiently shifting power. And so one way is and this does require a huge amount of trust with your clients and your partners, right? To bring forward past failures, or even harder, likely future failures if certain paths are taken, it does require a huge amount of trust. Yeah. So I think, again, I feel like this has been easier for me to do over time as I've developed really strong relationships with the people that I work with, and a history and background and reputation. So this is more challenging when you're early in your work. But basically bringing forward those examples to really clearly say, if you do not shift power sufficiently and appropriately, this will all be for naught. You don't want to invest the time and the resources to do this unless you're going to get a good outcome, right? And what does good outcome look like? And usually, my experience is that really most municipal folks, they are not making enough money for this to be just a pure power trip for most of them. Yeah. They really are trying to serve the public. And that doesn't mean that they know exactly how to do it and how to do it well. But if you can make the case that shifting power is in the interest of the municipality, and when I say the municipality, I mean at various levels within the municipality, right? You have to understand the sort of power dynamics within that structure and find how all the interests along the way within the structure can be met. But it's really a matter of making that kind of clear and sophisticated argument. Now, I'll just quickly say, I can't know in advance how the municipality needs to behave in order to shift that power. You have to advocate also for the process of understanding what does that power shifting look like? And that can mean assessment and relationship building with the folks to whom the power should be shifted, right? That doesn't happen overnight, and it's hard to assess. So you have to build that into the process.
Great. There's a variety of questions on different actors. So there was another one also about, what do you think the biggest role for these large environmental nonprofits, so TNC, EDF, could be, and how should they come in to be most helpful in the kind of work that you've been leading?
Well, I hope TNC will not mind that I actually talk about them directly, because I have done quite a bit of work with the Nature Conservancy in New York in particular, and have a project with TNC Massachusetts right now to ask exactly this question: where can we make the biggest difference given what we have to offer? And I hesitate to try to answer this question in any way that would suggest I'm answering it in a comprehensive way. So just bear with me. I'm going to just share a tiny piece of this. So the Nature Conservancy in New York, when we did some work to ask their stakeholders what role they thought TNC New York could play most powerfully, ultimately what the response was is that you could work on and should work on the space between water and land. So protecting those buffers that we have, the natural buffers that we already have, making sure that some of those places that are developed become undeveloped over time in responsible ways. And in places that can't happen, making sure that people are as safe as possible in that sort of interface between water and land. And so they restructured their work. The adaptation team restructured their work to focus on that sort of hierarchy I just laid out, to really double down on protecting those critical interface spaces, and to then work on undevelopment in the right ways and places, and then finally to work on protective measures where they couldn't. And what that meant was for them, and again, not a comprehensive answer, but in some pieces, to really use their scientific rigor to support work that others were doing, particularly where there was community work required, that they would not attempt to be the face of that work in those communities, but they would attempt to provide both technical and financial resources to those frontline, grassroots organizers. And I think in general, this is a pretty good formula for the big environmental groups to think about what are the things that we have to offer, right? Whether it's scientific rigor or policy, policy chops or whatever we have, to try to think about who's doing the work on the ground and in what ways can we support them and in what space. TNC in this case, in this particular area, chose to work at that land water interface, but there may be different places where others would work, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. We had a question on balancing private property and property rights with, the need of the community. How do you address folks who are, going to be affected on their personal property? And have you come up to situations where you've needed to mediate in those examples?
Yeah, this is really hard. We are really trying to figure this out. And when I say we, I mean like a very broad we. So at the Climigration Network, we're certainly trying to figure this out. And anyone who's interested in this challenge, I think I would encourage you to reach out and try to join the network. So that's one. But I'm doing a project right now, for example. It's just in the works. So we're just starting to understand it. But there are people who manage buyout programs throughout the country, programs that use public money to buy private property, right? And these programs are voluntary. So the people who get bought out want to be bought out. These are not eminent domain programs, they're voluntary buyout programs. And these programs are not designed to, they were not designed for a managed retreat, if you will, or a managed relocation in sort of a collective way. They were designed to address sort of parcel by parcel voluntary moves and relocations. And one question that we're trying to really grapple with is, how could these programs be improved in a variety of ways, but in at least one of these ways is to address some of the more collective relocations. And I know this is not exactly what the person was asking about, but I'm saying it because part of the reason we have such a challenging system around relocations when it comes to private property is that we do have such an individualistic sort of approach, both in mindset and in legal terms. And I think that given the scale of the problem, the challenge that we have of so much private property being in peril, at risk from climate change, is that we have to develop both a different mindset around private property and different legal and administrative and regulatory tools to encourage more collective thinking and more collective behavior around this, around relocation. So I think the simple answer to the question is we don't really know. It is a really tough challenge. But I think that there are people who are working hard to try to find different ways to use some of the tools we already have, and then of course to create and imagine new tools.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you for that. A question that I think is interesting because it's very specific to climate, but it could also be extended to, any kind of negotiation, which is the tension between wanting to come to a consensus, which of course, or, to an agreement when, especially when you're talking about climate, conveys a huge sense of urgency, right? The desire to go fast and move forward with the necessary adherence to a process, which means you need to slow down. How do you sort of balance these two timeframes that you need to act on? Because what you're talking about, process design and getting stakeholder buy-in, really does require a certain amount of time to set the process and the rules and get everybody on board. But obviously, we're trying to go quickly because the projects that you're managing are very important and need resolution. How do you think about those two tensions in terms of time frame?
This project, or this question, excuse me, is feels really hard to answer in the abstract, but when I think about the projects that I work on, it becomes slightly less challenging. And what I mean by that is that you can only work as fast as you can work. And that's why when I was talking about sort of the like grease and bumpers, like the limitations that are around you, yes, those of us who work in climate feel this tremendous urgency. But when you work on real projects with real people, you just say, this is what we can do in this time with the money that we have and with the people that we have. There's only so much capacity. Now, I think it is more in the realm of activists to try to push for such substantial increases in attention and resources to this issue that we could accelerate dramatically. The reality is, I think like I work in a space where you have to get done what you can do with what you have, right? And that's where we are. Our work as practitioners depends on the success of the activists who are trying to push for the capacity to make, to rise to this moment of urgency. And in my mind, the only thing that makes us, that can possibly accelerate that in the way that we need is just like a truly colossal increase of resources and attention and care to this issue. And that doesn't come like, project by project. That comes with huge societal change. And that only happens, I think, through advocacy. So if someone feels like so urgent about this and they're sort of more of a practitioner type like me, they might consider whether they need to go more into the advocacy space, because that's where I think things, where that acceleration can happen or will be driven by those activists.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Thank you so much. I have absolutely peppered you with questions and you have answered everyone. There are more, but unfortunately we're going to be at time, so we will leave it at that. Carri, you had graciously volunteered to give your contact information. Would it be okay for us to put an email, or how would you like to be contacted?
You can put it in an email. That's fine. Sure. Yeah. And people can connect with me on LinkedIn as well, although I don't check it as regularly as I should, but that's a good way too.
Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful. So that you can get in touch with Carri if you have further questions. Well, Carri, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Wonderful discussion. And everyone, thank you so much for being here with us today. As ever, we have a variety of upcoming events through the rest of the semester. Looking forward to having you there. In advance, I will wish everyone in the United States a happy Thanksgiving, an important holiday for those of us here. And we have a lot to be grateful for this year as ever. We've just put up on the screen, in case you're interested in still engaging with PON over the course of the coming months, a bunch of our one-day programs for which we've launched registration in the spring semester. And I'm delighted to say that the May and June ones will actually be held in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and not on Zoom. And that feels like something that I am certainly for which I am very grateful at this particular moment. So we look forward to seeing you on a screen or perhaps in person at some point soon. Thank you again to everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much, Carri, for your gracious time. And we wish you a wonderful rest of the day. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.